The call that changed everything. The morning sun crept slowly through the window blinds of Sundar Pichai's California home, painting soft golden lines across his desk. He had been awake since before dawn, reviewing reports for Google's next product cycle. Yet his mind wasn't on the charts or numbers. Somewhere deep inside, he felt the quiet hum of something that didn't fit in the usual rhythm of his days. A strange anticipation, as if the world was holding its breath. The phone on the desk buzzed softly, flashing a name that made his heart pause. It was his father. For a second, Sundar just stared at the screen. His father rarely called during work hours. The older man had always been careful not to disturb his son's professional life. But that morning, Sundar's hand trembled slightly as he picked up the call. There was silence for a few seconds, and then a voice, fragile, slow, carrying both age and emotion, came through. "Sundar," his father said quietly, "can you come home?" The words were simple, but they carried a weight that struck Sundar deeper than he expected. The tone wasn't his father's usual calm. It sounded uncertain, almost broken. Memories flashed in his mind. The smell of wet earth in Chennai, the hum of ceiling fans in their small house, the sight of his father sitting late at night, fixing electrical parts to earn extra income. That man had always been the pillar of strength. He was the one who had believed in Sundar when the world saw only an average boy from a modest family, and now that same man was asking for help. Sundar's heart tightened. "Appa, what happened?" he asked gently. There was another pause, and then the faint sound of his father clearing his throat. "I'll tell you when you come," he said softly. "Please, just come." After the call ended, Sundar sat back in his chair, staring blankly at the morning light. His thoughts tangled between deadlines and emotions. He had meetings lined up, interviews, and a keynote scheduled in 2 days. But all of that suddenly felt meaningless. He stood up slowly, the old ache of duty rising in his chest. For years he had worked to make his parents proud, to give them comfort, to be the son who lifted the family from the struggles of his childhood. Yet now it seemed that what his father needed wasn't wealth or success. It was something else, something deeper. The flight to India felt longer than ever. As the plane soared over the dark ocean, Sundar looked out through the window, his reflection merging with the stars beyond. He thought of the last time he had seen his father. It had been almost a year. His father's hair had turned fully gray, his steps slower, but his eyes still carried the same quiet strength. Sundar had promised to visit more often, but promises had a way of fading under the weight of work and distance. Now that guilt pressed against him like a stone in his chest. When he finally arrived in Chennai, the air felt heavier, thicker with memories. His childhood street looked smaller than he remembered, the old gate creaking as he pushed it open. His mother came out first, her eyes filling with tears the moment she saw him. She didn't speak, she just held him. Sundar felt like a boy again, standing in the small living room where every wall seemed to echo with years of laughter, arguments, and dreams. And then in the corner of the room he saw his father sitting quietly, staring out of the window. The once strong man now looked fragile, his shoulders slightly bent, but when he turned toward Sundar there was still that familiar spark in his eyes, a spark of quiet pride. "You came," he said, smiling faintly. Sundar knelt beside him. "Of course I came," he whispered. "You asked for me." His father nodded slowly, his fingers trembling as he reached out to hold his son's hand. "I didn't want to disturb you," he said, "but there's something I need to tell you, something I can't carry alone anymore." The next words came like a whisper carried on the wind. His father spoke of a man who had once helped him decades ago, someone who had changed his life when Sundar was still a child. This man had given his father a small loan to start his workshop when no one else believed in him. And now, after all these years, that man's son had fallen into hardship. "He came to see me last week," his father said, his voice cracking. He didn't ask for much, only a chance for his boy. "I told him I would speak to you. I told him you wouldn't forget what kindness means." For a long moment, Sundar said nothing. He could see the pain in his father's eyes, not for himself, but for the burden of gratitude he still carried after all these years. It was as if time had looped back to remind them both where they came from. "What do you want me to do, Appa?" Sundar finally asked. His father looked at him with quiet desperation. "Help him," he said simply. "But not because you owe me or because of money. Help him because I raised you to never forget the hands that lifted you when you were down." That night Sundar couldn't sleep. He sat on the balcony of his old room, staring at the city lights flickering in the distance. His mind drifted between the boy he once was and the man he had become. There had been a time when his family couldn't afford even a simple refrigerator, when his father had repaired radios by candlelight so Sundar could study. And now, he was the CEO of one of the biggest companies in the world, a symbol of success to millions. But none of that felt real in that moment. What felt real was his father's trembling voice asking for help, not for himself, but for someone else. By morning, Sundar had made a decision. He would find that man's son no matter what it took. It wasn't about charity. It was about respect. The next few hours moved quickly. Sundar visited the small neighborhood where his father's friend used to live. The narrow lanes were filled with the familiar rhythm of Indian mornings. Children in school uniforms, street vendors shouting, and the smell of chai drifting through the air. He asked around, and finally, an elderly woman pointed him toward a small, half-broken house near the corner. "That's where Raman's family lives," she said softly. "They've been through a lot lately." When Sundar knocked on the door, there was no answer. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a young man in his early 20s, thin and tired, his eyes wary. "Yes?" he asked. Sundar hesitated before speaking. "My name is Sundar," he said gently. "I knew your father." The young man's expression changed instantly. Confusion, recognition, disbelief. "You're Sundar Pichai?" he whispered. Sundar nodded. The boy swallowed hard, his voice trembling. I've heard stories about how my father helped yours," he said quietly. "But my father passed away last month." The words hit Sundar like a quiet storm. He stood there, unable to speak for a few seconds. The boy looked down, his voice breaking. "He used to tell me," he said, "that kindness always finds its way back. But I guess he never lived to see that." Sundar felt something deep within him shift. In that moment, the line between success and humanity blurred completely. He realized that his father's request wasn't just about repaying a favor. It was about completing a circle of compassion that had started long before him. "What's your name?" Sundar asked softly. "Aaron," the boy replied. "I studied computer science, but I couldn't find work. I tried, but people said I didn't have the right background or references." Sundar looked at him carefully, seeing both fear and potential. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he smiled faintly and said, "Aaron, tell me about your dreams." And as the boy began to speak, something extraordinary happened. Sundar saw himself, the same hunger, the same fire, the same uncertainty that had once lived in his own eyes. The conversation lasted for hours, filled with honesty and hope. By the time Sundar stood to leave, he had already made a silent promise to himself. He would not let this story end in struggle. But as he walked back toward his car, his phone buzzed again. Another call, this time from Google headquarters. A crisis had erupted, a data issue, global scale, urgent. Sundar stopped in his tracks, torn between two worlds, one of duty and one of heart. He looked back at the small house, then at the glowing screen in his hand. And in that moment, he realized the true test of leadership wasn't about power or title. It was about choice. The promise and the price. The next morning began with the low hum of temple bells echoing through the narrow streets, a sound that always brought Sundar back to his roots. He stood quietly by the window of his parents' old home, sipping tea that his mother had made just the way she always did, milky, sweet, and comforting. The calm of the morning stood in sharp contrast to the noise inside his head. He had barely slept. The image of Aaron, standing in that worn shirt with uncertain eyes, replayed in his mind over and over. Sundar had met countless young talents across the world. But something about that boy's honesty had struck him deeper than any resume ever could. There was raw determination there, and also silent despair, the kind that came from years of being overlooked. His father joined him at the window, moving slowly with his cane. "You found him?" he asked quietly. Sundar nodded. "I did. But his father is gone." The old man's face fell, his eyes softening with sorrow. "I feared that," he said after a long pause. "Still, I'm glad you went. Sometimes, even if it's too late for the one who helped us, it's not too late for their children." Sundar turned toward him, the weight of the previous night still pressing on his heart. "Appa," he said softly, "you always taught me that helping others is a duty, not a favor. I think I understand that now more than ever." But before he could say more, his phone vibrated again. The crisis he had ignored the previous day had grown worse. Messages filled the screen with words like urgent, security breach, and press inquiry. Sundar closed his eyes briefly, feeling that old familiar pull of two worlds colliding, one personal, one professional. "I have to go," he murmured. His father looked at him quietly and placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "Go," he said with a small smile. "But don't forget what you promised." Sundar nodded silently. That simple sentence carried the weight of generations. As he drove to the airport, his thoughts raced faster than the traffic around him. He was torn between the corporate storm awaiting him in California and the quiet duty his heart had accepted in Chennai. But Sundar had always believed that true integrity was not about choosing between right and wrong. It was about choosing between what was easy and what was meaningful. And deep down, he knew he couldn't leave Aaron's fate to chance. Before boarding his flight, he sent a message to his assistant in the United States. "Find a role for a young developer named Arun Raman. Remote if needed. Skill test optional. I'll handle the rest." When Sundar landed in California hours later, the air felt sharper, colder. Within minutes of stepping into his office, he was surrounded by chaos. A boardroom filled with tension, screens flashing with data, engineers speaking in hurried tones. But amidst the noise, his mind kept wandering back to that narrow street in Chennai. His father's words echoed like a whisper between the hum of servers and the clicking of keyboards. "Help him because you were raised to never forget kindness." By evening, the crisis was under control, but Sundar's exhaustion wasn't just from work. It came from carrying too many worlds inside him. The CEO, the son, the human being trying not to forget his origins. He sat alone in his office, the city lights stretching endlessly below. He thought about how strange life was, how one phone call from his father had reminded him of everything he'd once vowed to never forget. He picked up his phone again, checking if there was any reply from Arun. There wasn't. Sundar hesitated for a moment, then sent another message directly to the boy. "I didn't forget you. We'll talk soon." The next few days passed quickly. Between media briefings, investor calls, and product reviews, Sundar found himself searching for moments of silence. Moments where he could reconnect with the part of himself that existed before fame and power. One night after a long meeting, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Arun. It read simply, "Thank you for remembering me. I don't know if I deserve this, but I'll give it everything I have." Sundar smiled for the first time that week. He replied instantly, "You don't need to deserve it. You just need to believe in it." Within weeks, Aaron began working remotely with a small engineering team. He was quiet at first, unsure of how to fit into a world so far removed from his own. But soon, Sundar began hearing whispers through his managers about a young developer from India who was solving problems faster than expected, who stayed late not because he was told to, but because he genuinely cared. Sundar didn't reveal to anyone how he knew Arun. He wanted the boy to rise on his own merit, but deep down he felt a growing sense of pride, not as a CEO, but as a son fulfilling his father's wish. Then came a day Sundar didn't expect. His father called again. This time the tone of his voice was calm, almost peaceful. "I saw the news," he said softly. "They mentioned a young engineer from India being recognized for innovation. That's him, isn't it?" Sundar smiled. "Yes, Appa, that's him." There was silence on the other end for a while, and then his father said words that would stay with him forever. "You see, my son, sometimes what we give returns not in wealth, but in peace. I can rest easy now." Sundar's eyes welled with emotion. He didn't know why, but something in his father's tone sounded final, as if the old man had found closure to a story long unfinished. A few nights later, Sundar received another call. But this one wasn't from his father. It was from his mother. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Appa, he's gone, Sundar," she whispered. "He passed in his sleep." Sundar froze, the phone slipping slightly from his hand. For a long moment he couldn't breathe. The room around him blurred as tears filled his eyes. He had spoken to his father just 2 nights ago, and now, that voice, the one that had shaped every part of his life, was gone. The next morning, Sundar was on a plane again, flying back to India. This time there was no anticipation, only grief. When he arrived, the small house felt emptier than ever. His mother sat quietly beside the framed photograph of his father, garlanded with flowers. Sundar knelt before it, his hands trembling as he whispered, "I did it, Appa. I kept my promise." Tears streamed down his face, but in his heart he felt something more powerful than sadness. He felt purpose. That night he stepped outside, the air heavy with rain and memory. He looked at the sky and whispered softly, "Thank you for teaching me what success really means." And as if the universe was listening, a gentle wind swept through the street, rustling the trees and carrying the faint scent of jasmine, the scent that always reminded him of home. But far away, in another time zone, another story was quietly beginning. Aaron had just received a message inviting him to California to present his project directly to the Google board. He couldn't believe his eyes. His heart raced as he read the email again. He didn't know that Sundar himself had personally arranged it. He didn't know that this was just the beginning of something far greater, not just for him, but for the legacy of two fathers who had believed in kindness above all else. As Sundar stood alone under the dark sky, he didn't know it either, but destiny was already moving its next piece. The return of gratitude. The air in California carried that sharp chill of late evening when Sundar sat alone in his office again, staring at a photo of his father that now rested on his desk. His father's passing had left a hollow space that no success or applause could fill. Still, there was peace, a quiet satisfaction in knowing he had fulfilled the man's last wish. But deep inside, he also knew that something much larger had begun to unfold, something his father might have foreseen but never spoken aloud. Arun's progress was that spark, a living reminder that kindness travels in circles and returns in ways no one expects. Days passed, and Sundar immersed himself in work. He reviewed reports, signed off new initiatives, and continued shaping Google's path forward. Yet behind the corporate layers, there was still the human in him, the son, the dreamer, the believer in simple acts of goodness. Every so often, he would check in silently on Aaron's progress. The reports came in glowing. The boy had not only integrated quickly but had led a small team to fix a complex bug that had stalled an internal tool for months. Managers were impressed, but none of them knew the deeper story behind this quiet genius from Chennai. One Friday afternoon, as the sky turned a deep orange outside his window, Sundar's assistant entered with a note. "Sir," she said softly, "the young engineer Arun Raman, he's here. He's been invited to present his project." Sundar paused, his pen frozen in midair. For a moment, the noise of the office disappeared. He looked up slowly and said, "Send him in." A few seconds later, Aaron stepped into the room, his posture uncertain, his hands slightly trembling. He looked around, awestruck by the vast space, the tall glass walls and the quiet authority that seemed to fill every corner. "Sir?" Arun began nervously. "Thank you for having me." Sundar smiled faintly. "Please sit down," he said gently. "I've heard good things about your work." Aaron lowered himself into the chair, trying to steady his voice. "I just wanted to do my best," he said, "for my team. And for my father." That last phrase caught Sundar's attention. "Your father?" he asked softly. Aaron nodded. "He used to tell me that success isn't about being seen. It's about being remembered for the good you do." I didn't understand it fully until now. Sundar leaned back, his heart tightening slightly. It felt as though destiny had arranged this meeting not just for professional recognition, but for closure. "Your father was a good man," Sundar said, his voice low. "My father never forgot him." Aaron's eyes widened as he realized what those words meant. For a few seconds, neither spoke. It was as if two generations of kindness and struggle had silently met across that desk. Finally, Aaron said softly, "My father told me he once helped a man who went on to do great things. He never mentioned your name, but he always said that man would repay kindness one day. Not in money, but in faith." Sundar felt a lump rise in his throat. "Then he was right," he whispered. The meeting went on, but it felt less like an official presentation and more like an exchange between two souls connected by gratitude. Aaron presented his project, a system designed to improve rural education through adaptive technology. It wasn't just a program, it was a bridge between worlds. The software learned the pace of each student and adjusted lessons to suit their abilities. It was meant for children like Sundar once was. Children from small towns who had dreams but few tools to reach them. When the presentation ended, the room was silent. Sundar stood, walked to the window and said quietly, "You just built something that can change lives." Aaron looked at him uncertainly. "Do you really think so, sir?" Sundar turned and nodded. "I know so, but there's one condition." Aaron frowned slightly. "Condition?" Sundar smiled. "You won't call me sir. You'll call me Sundar. I'm not your boss today. I'm someone continuing a promise my father made long ago. Aaron smiled shyly for the first time that day, and Sundar could see the resemblance to his younger self, that same hesitant confidence that needed only one person to believe in it. In the weeks that followed, Sundar arranged for Aaron's project to be fully funded and expanded. The idea was to bring technology to the smallest corners of India, to classrooms that had never seen a computer before. The plan was bold, but Sundar believed it was the most meaningful initiative they could undertake. When the board questioned the investment, Sundar didn't mention Arun's name or the personal story behind it. He simply said, "Sometimes the best innovation comes from remembering where we came from." The project began rolling out quietly, first in Tamil Nadu, then in remote areas across India. Sundar returned to India once again, this time not for family or duty but for hope. When he arrived in a small village school to see the first live demo of the software, he was greeted by children sitting on the floor with tablets in their hands, their faces lit up with curiosity. One little girl looked up at him and said, "Sir, this thing talks to me in Tamil. It teaches me like my mother." Sundar knelt down beside her, smiling through a rush of emotion. He thought of his father again, of the man who had fixed radios so his son could dream of the world beyond. Aaron stood beside him, silently watching the moment unfold. When the demo ended, Sundar turned to him and said, "You've done something powerful." Aaron shook his head. "No," he said softly. "We've done something powerful. Because if your father hadn't believed in mine, I wouldn't be here. And if you hadn't believed in me, these children wouldn't be learning now." Sundar nodded, his eyes glistening. "Maybe that's the secret of success," he said. "It isn't measured by how high we rise, but by how many we lift when we do." But just when everything seemed to fall perfectly into place, life reminded them both that every story has its tests. One evening, while Sundar was preparing for his return flight, he received an urgent call from his legal team. Someone had leaked information about the education project, twisting the story into a scandal. The headline suggested that funds were being used for personal connections, that Sundar had hired and promoted a friend's son through favoritism. His name was suddenly everywhere, in news channels, on social media, surrounded by questions and judgment. Aaron found out too, and the news devastated him. People in the company began whispering, doubting his talent, accusing him of being the reason for Sundar's supposed favoritism. His inbox filled with cruel comments and mockery. It was as if overnight everything they had built on trust had turned into fuel for gossip. Aaron sent Sundar a message that night, filled with guilt and sorrow. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to cause you trouble. Maybe I should leave." Sundar read the message and felt the familiar weight of the world settle on his shoulders again. He looked at his father's photograph on his desk, remembering the promise he had made, to never let kindness become a weakness. Then he took a deep breath and replied simply, "Don't run. We'll face this together." But neither of them knew how far this storm would reach, and by the time morning came, the headlines had grown darker, claiming that Sundar's reputation, built over decades, might be at risk. The storm of truth, the next few days felt like walking through thunder without shelter. Sundar's name, once associated with innovation and integrity, was suddenly being tossed around in headlines that burned with suspicion. Journalists dug into Aaron's background, twisting his humble beginnings into something suspicious, as if poverty itself was a crime. Online articles labeled the education project as personal philanthropy disguised as corporate funding. The board of directors scheduled an emergency meeting, and messages from colleagues came filled with cautious sympathy. Words like, "We know you meant well," and "this will pass," that only deepened the ache in Sundar's chest. At first, Sundar stayed silent. He had faced public pressure before, and criticism, rumors, misunderstandings, but this was different. This was personal. This wasn't about strategy or leadership. It was about his father's values being questioned, about the meaning of kindness being turned into ammunition for gossip. Every time he saw a headline pairing his name with favoritism, something inside him twisted. It wasn't anger, it was disappointment. How easily the world forgot that compassion could exist without agenda. Arun, on the other hand, was barely holding himself together. He hadn't left his apartment in days. His laptop sat open, the project files still glowing on the screen untouched. Every notification brought another wave of hate. People accusing him of using Sundar's sympathy to climb ladders, mocking his father's legacy, calling him the CEO's pet. The boy who had once dreamed of building something good now sat in silence, staring at the same hands that had once typed with hope. His mother called him from India, her voice shaking with worry. "Come home, Aaron," she pleaded. "This isn't your world." But he couldn't leave now, not when the storm he never asked for was destroying the man who had believed in him. Late one evening, as the office lights dimmed and the city outside shimmered under cold rain, Sundar stood alone by the window of his corner office. The building was quiet now, too quiet. The world had gone home to rest while he wrestled with the noise of judgment. On his desk lay the report he had written years ago when he first joined Google, about technology serving humanity. It now felt like a mirror reflecting the question he had tried to avoid. How much of himself had he lost in the race to maintain an image? And yet even now he didn't regret helping Aaron. He only regretted not protecting him better. His assistant entered softly, holding a folder. "The board meeting is tomorrow morning," she said. "They'll ask for explanations." Sundar nodded. "They should," he replied quietly. "But I won't defend myself. I'll tell them the truth." She hesitated before speaking again. "And if they don't understand?" Sundar gave a small, weary smile. "Then maybe they were never meant to." The next morning, the boardroom was heavy with tension. Executives, lawyers, and advisors filled the long table, their expressions polite but cold. Flashes of cameras from the hallway hinted at the press waiting outside. When Sundar entered, the room fell silent. He took his seat slowly, placed his notes on the table, and looked around. "I know why we're here," he began, his voice steady. "You've all read the reports. You've seen the speculation. And yes, I helped a young man named Aaron Rahman. I gave him an opportunity because my father once received help, when no one else believed in him. It wasn't charity and it wasn't nepotism. It was gratitude passed forward." One of the directors leaned forward. "But Sundar," he said cautiously, "the optics are damaging. The shareholders are concerned that personal emotion may have influenced corporate policy." Sundar met his gaze calmly. "If compassion is now considered a liability," he said softly, "then maybe we need to redefine what kind of company we are." There was silence in the room, broken only by the faint hum of the projector. Another voice spoke, more skeptical. "But this young man, he has no formal references, no proven track record. How can we justify the funding?" Sundar turned to the screen and clicked a button. Data appeared, reports, analytics, growth metrics from Aaron's project. Charts showing improved engagement, literacy rates, and measurable progress in rural schools. Because results, Sundar said quietly, don't come from pedigree. They come from purpose. For a long moment, no one spoke. The numbers were undeniable. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their expressions softening slightly. Finally, the chairman cleared his throat. "We appreciate your transparency, Sundar," he said. "But the public perception will take time to repair. I hope you're prepared for that." Sundar nodded. "I've been prepared for it my whole life," he said simply. "Because when my father couldn't afford books, it wasn't public perception that taught me to dream. It was people like the man who helped him. And that man's son deserved the same chance." After the meeting, as Sundar walked through the hallway, reporters rushed forward with cameras and microphones. "Mr. Pichai, did you use company funds for personal gain?" One shouted. "Was this young man a family acquaintance?" Another demanded. Sundar stopped, turned toward them, and said with calm conviction, "No, he was a stranger who reminded me of where I came from. And if helping someone honest makes me guilty, then I'm proud to stand accused." The clip went viral within hours. Millions watched as the CEO of one of the world's biggest companies spoke not like an executive, but like a human being stripped of pretense. People began sharing their own stories. Teachers who had helped poor students, strangers who had paid for someone's meal, friends who had been lifted by kindness. The tide slowly began to turn. Articles that once accused him of favoritism now spoke of compassion and leadership. But even as the world debated, Sundar stayed quiet, avoiding interviews. He wasn't interested in redemption through headlines. He just wanted peace. Meanwhile, Aaron couldn't bear to watch the chaos unfold. He booked a flight and went straight to Sundar's office without an appointment. When the security guard stopped him, he pleaded, "Please tell him it's Aaron. He'll know." Moments later, Sundar opened the door himself. Aaron's eyes were red from exhaustion. "Why didn't you tell them to fire me?" he asked, voice trembling. "You could have saved yourself." Sundar looked at him, his gaze gentle but firm. "If I had done that," he said, "I would have betrayed everything my father taught me. We don't abandon people just because it's easier." Aaron's voice broke as he said, "But I ruined your image. I ruined everything you built. Sundar shook his head. You didn't ruin anything, he replied softly. You reminded me that goodness always demands a price, but it's a price worth paying. He paused, placing a hand on Aaron's shoulder. Now it's time you stop apologizing and start fighting back. Prove them wrong. Show them why I believed in you. From that moment, something changed in Arun. The shame that had held him hostage began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination. He returned to his team, working harder than ever. He volunteered to lead the public presentation of their next phase, facing questions head-on. When the reporters tried to corner him, he didn't hide. He simply said, I'm not here because of privilege. I'm here because someone believed that potential shouldn't be limited by background. His words spread across social media, resonating with people everywhere, the students, workers, dreamers who had once been told they weren't enough. And in that wave of support, the project regained its strength. Schools that had paused participation began to rejoin. The noise of doubt started fading beneath the louder sound of hope. Sundar watched it all unfold quietly. He didn't make speeches or seek applause. He just smiled when he saw Aaron's face on the news, not as a scandal but as a symbol of perseverance. Yet somewhere deep down, he sensed that this chapter wasn't the end. He could feel the quiet tension building again, the sense that fate was preparing one last test, and that test would not be about reputation or forgiveness. It would be about truth, the kind that cannot be spun, edited, or hidden behind press releases. The legacy of light. The weeks that followed brought a fragile calm like the silence that lingers after a storm has passed. But the clouds still hover on the horizon. Sundar's project, once under fire, was now being hailed as one of the most impactful educational initiatives in years. The backlash had transformed into admiration. Journalists who had once questioned his motives were now writing about leadership with empathy, and how one man's act of faith had rekindled public belief in decency. But Sundar, despite the praise, didn't bask in it. He had learned that recognition was fleeting. What mattered was what remained after the noise faded. He spent more time away from the spotlight, visiting schools in small towns, talking to children whose laughter filled classrooms that used to echo with silence. In each child's bright eyes, he saw pieces of his father's dream, a world where no one's future was defined by their past. Sometimes, as he stood under the rustling banyan trees outside the schools, he felt that maybe his father was there too, watching quietly, proud of the son who had chosen heart over convenience. Meanwhile, Arun's journey had changed in ways even he couldn't believe. His project had become the backbone of a new department, focused on accessibility and learning innovation. He was invited to speak at conferences to share his experience of how belief can change a life. Yet whenever people called him a prodigy or the man who saved his CEO's vision, Aaron only smiled and said, "No, I'm just proof that one act of kindness can start a chain reaction." But destiny had one more moment left to reveal, one that neither of them expected. One evening after a long day of meetings, Sundar received a package with no sender name. It was small, wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside, he found an old notebook, its pages yellowed by time. On the first page, in faded ink, was a line written in Tamil. "True wealth is not what you earn, it's what you return." Beneath it was a signature. It was Raman, Aaron's father. The notebook contained journal entries, old calculations, and sketches of electrical circuits, fragments of a man's modest dreams. But near the end, there was a page that stopped Sundar cold. It was dated 20 years ago. The entry read, "Today I lent money to a man who reminded me of myself. He said he would repay me someday, but I told him not to. I told him the only debt worth paying forward is kindness. Maybe one day our children will meet. Maybe they'll understand what we tried to build." Sundar's hands trembled as he read it again and again. Tears welled in his eyes, not of sadness but of awe. That promise between two fathers had found its way through time, through generations across oceans to fulfill itself exactly as written. The next morning, Sundar called Arun to his office. When the young man entered, Sundar simply handed him the notebook without saying a word. Arun opened it, scanning the pages until his eyes froze on his father's handwriting. His lips parted and his voice broke into a whisper. "This is his. He wrote this when I was a child," he said. He looked up at Sundar, his eyes glassy with disbelief. "How did you get this?" Sundar smiled softly. "It found me," he said. Maybe it was waiting for this moment. They sat in silence for a long time, both men united by the weight of their father's hopes. Finally, Aaron spoke. "Do you think they knew this would happen?" Sundar looked out the window, watching sunlight break through the clouds. Maybe they didn't know the details, he said quietly. But they understood something deeper, that goodness is never wasted. It always finds its way back. In the months that followed, Sundar and Aaron worked together to expand the project globally. It was no longer just an educational tool, and it became a philosophy, a movement. They called it Project Return, inspired by Raman's words. Its message was simple but profound. Help someone not because they can repay you, but because one day someone else will need the same kindness. Schools from Africa to Latin America adopted the program. Volunteers from hundreds of countries joined. The initiative became bigger than both of them, touching lives they would never meet. And yet, in the midst of all that success, Sundar found himself increasingly drawn to silence. One evening, after a long conference, he drove alone to a small hill on the outskirts of Chennai, the place where his father used to take him as a boy to watch sunsets. The air was warm, the sky painted in shades of orange and violet. Sundar sat on a rock, watching the horizon as if it held the answers to every question that had followed him through life. He spoke softly, not to anyone visible, but to the memory of his father that lived within him. "Appa," he murmured, "you once told me that a good life isn't about how much we achieve, but how many we uplift. I think I finally understand." As the sun dipped lower, he took the notebook from his bag and placed it on the ground beside him. A soft wind turned its pages as if unseen hands were reading them once more. And then, in that perfect quiet, Sundar smiled. For the first time in years, he felt no rush, no pressure, no fear. Only gratitude for the journey, for the lessons, for the lives intertwined by fate and faith. Somewhere far away, in a small classroom where a teacher used the very software Aaron had created, a young girl looked up from her screen and said, "This app says it was built to honor two fathers who believed in kindness." Her teacher smiled and replied, "Yes, my dear. And that's why we must keep learning. Not just facts, but goodness." Back in California, months later, Sundar received an invitation to a global summit on human innovation. He was expected to give a grand speech about technology, leadership, and the future. But when he walked on stage, his words were simple. "People often ask me what the most powerful innovation of our time is," he began, his tone soft but steady. "It's not artificial intelligence or algorithms or machines. It's compassion. It's the courage to believe in someone when the world doubts them. Technology may shape the future, but kindness gives it meaning." The crowd rose in applause, but Sundar's gaze went far beyond the lights. He thought of Aaron sitting somewhere in the audience, of their fathers, of every silent act of humanity that never made headlines. And in that moment, he realized that legacy wasn't about invention or fame. It was about the light we leave behind when we choose to see others through grace instead of judgment. As he walked off the stage, he whispered to himself, "Thank you, Appa. The circle is complete." And in the quiet that followed, he felt something shift in the air, the unspoken blessing of a father's spirit, the echo of two generations whispering across time. Goodness always returns,